Hello and welcome to the Shape podcast. I'm Paulina, and as usual, I'm hosting this episode with my co host Junaid. We both work with the Saving Humanity and Planet Earth project, also known as the Shape Project. The Gaza genocide has dominated headlines for nearly 2 years, but now the crisis in West Asia has further amplified after the US struck Iran in the midst of US Iran nuclear negotiations, triggering a 12-day war and more. What did this escalation mean? How did we get here? And where do we go from here? To help us break it down, we're joined by Dr. Assal Rad, a historian of modern West Asia who researches and writes prolifically on many issues, including US foreign policy, contemporary Iran, and Israel Palestine. Her work and commentary has been featured on scores of international media outlets, but many will also know her for her outstanding work on social media exposing propaganda and media hypocrisy with regard to the Gaza genocide. Thank you so much for joining us today, Asal.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Assal, if I may. We were thinking that was the cascading crises that are ongoing in West Asia, and specifically now with the expansion to a really scary and dangerous conflict with Iran, that who better to speak to than you? But at the same time, we are very conscious of what many people call the moral issue of our time, and that has been the genocide in Gaza. I mean, taking more and more macabre manifestations, from the beginning till now. So I did want to kind of begin with asking you. Right now we have seen some of the most heinous bombing and shooting and killing going on at this kind of fraudulent international humanitarian foundation there in Gaza. Um, in some ways, what's your sense of what's going on now, and what, in fact, the purpose for, I guess, I don't know, Israel or the United States, what the purpose is at this point?
Well, when you look at what's going on in terms of Israel, and I agree with you, by the way, the assessment that the Gaza genocide is the moral issue, not just the moral issue, but the geopolitical issue of our time. It's not to say that there aren't other populations that are at risk of starvation, that there aren't other populations that are, having atrocities committed against them. It is not to discount other conflicts and, genocides and wars that are going on throughout the world. But I think the reason what's unique in the case, I mean, the case of Gaza is unique for several reasons. Usually, people are allowed to, if when it's a war, people are allowed to leave, right? You're allowed to leave a place that is a war, and then you're allowed to come back. That's the other key point, because the way that you hear this notion of voluntary migration from Israeli officials, and what they obviously fail to say is that the Palestinians are reluctant to leave because they have no right of return. That's part of what makes it unique. What makes it unique is the unprecedented nature in which Israel has crossed essentially every red line that has existed for the last several decades. And that in and of itself is the reason why it's unique. It's unique because you have a Western world that, at least despite its being deeply, deeply flawed and not applying international law in so many cases, but you have a Western world who has talked about this notion of a rules-based order, completely shatter it. I mean, make it basically non-existent in order to serve Israel's agenda of genocide in Gaza. And the last bit I'll say is because a lot of times when we have crises, when we have a humanitarian crisis, when we have massive conflict, the solutions are not easy. You have to, they're complicated situations. You don't know who you send in, what you do, what is the leverage that you use, how do you change the situation on the ground? Right now, there are truckloads of food outside of Gaza. They're just sitting there. And it is a US ally, a Western ally that refuses to allow that food, that refuses to allow the institutions that were built by the international community to serve this very purpose, to do their job. And there is a ton of leverage that Western powers have to actually affect Israel's actions. Yet they've used none of it to do so. So you actually have a situation in which You could flood Gaza with food right now, but they refuse to do so. And the party that refuses to do so is tied in many ways to the Western powers that can make this happen rather than just using their words, but doing it through action. So I think those are the things to consider when we're thinking about Gaza. Obviously the most important being the suffering of Palestinians, the fact that the Gaza genocide is the culmination of decades of occupation, decades of Israel getting away with basically total impunity when it comes to international law, and the fact that the solutions are there. There's just no political will in the Western world, of all places, to
Hmm.
accomplish that.
Yeah, no, I absolutely. I think that's one of the things that at this stage of this late stage of this mass slaughter going on is the question of, where is this all headed at this point? There's, as you say, nothing stopping, nothing halting what's going on. The Palestinians, that's the point. I mean, they leave, no one's going to allow them to come back. And which is why many of these Palestinians, the people of Gaza who went to the south, went back to the north, even though there's nothing there to really, just rubble. And so it just seems like it's been an ongoing Nakba since 1948. But do you have any thoughts on kind of what you see as potentially happening, supposedly after, which we don't even know. We don't even know what you've described so far. It's the kind of insane indifference of the world to what's been happening, or the inability to stop it. But do you have any thoughts of potentially kind of like, where will this go? Where will the Palestinians go? What will happen to the Israel and Zionism?
I wish I had something optimistic to say. I really do. And I hold on to just glimmers of hope because I feel like it's the only thing we have. Um, these states will not act unless there is pressure on them from within the states themselves. Clearly, we've seen that. We've seen that there is a solution. There is the ability to, it's not a question of ability. It's a question of will. Will they do it? They can. They're just refusing to do so. But as long as in the same way that as long as there's no pressure on Israel, why would they stop? I mean, what is their ultimate goal? Well, land, stealing more and more Palestinian land. Israel is an expansionist state. Um, it they want more and more land, not just Palestinian land, but we've seen the way that they're continuing the occupation of the Golan Heights, which is Syrian territory, and going into even further Syrian territory. We see the occupation of southern Lebanon, which we've seen in the past as well, and continued presence right now. So there is the fact that ideologically speaking, you have an expansionist state that adheres to a ethno-nationalist belief of Jewish supremacy. Like these are aspects of the Israeli state that we have to really grapple with. You can't just say there's something, pragmatic about it, but there's something ideologically zealous about it too. Like why don't we ever talk about religious like fundamentalism or extremism when we talk about the state of Israel? Because we're having that conversation in the West, and in the Western narrative, there's an attempt to whitewash all of that. So you hear all the time about, if it's Muslims, we talk about religious extremism, but for some reason, Israel is never talked about in that way in the Western world. And yet all of that is playing into the sort of objectives that we're talking about. And you can talk about the material objectives, right? The idea that, well, why do they want more land? Well, Gaza has a bunch of resources. Why not want the land? Why not take land? Because land has resources. So there's those applications as well. As far as where we're going, unless there is pressure within third-party states to therefore put pressure on Israel, I don't see any scenario in which things will change. Now, what would pressure from within look like? We're seeing, like I said, glimmers of hope. We're seeing a little bit of that, like the consequences of elections. There were many factors that played into the 2024 election in the United States. And I'm not saying that Gaza was a central factor, but it was a significant factor. The fact that we had protests at Biden's rallies and then Harris's rallies throughout the period of 2024 because of the genocide in Gaza, that in and of itself brought negative attention, onto that administration and a continuation of that administration. That's not to say that the Trump administration is serving Palestinian interests in any way. It's simply to say that many Americans found themselves in a position where they could not in good conscience vote for an administration that claimed to be against fascism while supporting fascism in Israel, while supporting a genocide of all things. So
Right.
there are consequences to it. The election of Mamdani, I think, as a in the New York mayoral race, is another important indication or sign where the central attack on him, which is so bizarre, if you just take 1 minute to think about how weird is it that in a New York City mayoral race, Israel is a key factor. Foreign
Right.
policy is not really a New York mayoral issue. But for some reason, this is brought into our political discourse, even in local elections. But despite that, despite the attempts to smear him, it didn't work. So
Mm.
the idea that believing that Palestinians are equal human beings that have equal rights is a political liability in the US is also starting to lose credibility as an argument. And you can even see that in the fact that you have not just on you know the democratic or independent side of the aisle that would be more left leaning, but even on the right leaning side of more like independent Republican Party candidates or representatives, more criticism of US policy vis-a-vis Israel. There is a growing, I mean, because look at the polling in the US. There's a massive shift in polling in the US in terms of support for Israel and support versus support for Palestinians.
Mm.
So those shifts are creating at least a little bit of pressure points that might be the kinds of things that we need to see internally in order for something to change. I mean, we quite literally, we need the leadership to change if we want the policies to change.
Yeah, this is so true. I'll hand it over to Paulina, but that's in some ways the most bewildering aspect of this, that it's not just as you just pointed out, it's not just the base of the Democratic Party anymore. It's even kind of Republicans that are speaking about this. Maybe the majority of Republican young people are against what Israel is doing. So that you're absolutely right. Public opinion on this issue over the years and decades, it's shifted dramatically, and it's that disconnect between that and then the politicians in Washington kind of all being bought by the Israeli lobby. I think that at some stage, it's this is what hopefully will give us some hope and and change. But please, Paulina.
Yeah, sure. Just to kind of try and tie in the issue of the Gaza genocide to what took place in Iran at the hands of Israel, I was wondering if you could maybe walk us through some of the connections that you see between what's happening in Gaza and what has happened in Iran, and perhaps if that's also a way to help us make sense of what really happened. I think a lot of people, just third-party observers, were astounded that, in the midst of nuclear negotiations with the US, all of a sudden bombings occurred and the rest of what we know happened. So yes, I was just wondering if you could maybe elaborate on those points.
Well, I think the most important connection, the way that you can see how they're interrelated, beyond the fact that Israel is at the center of all of it, right? There's one party
Mm.
that is attacking all of its neighbors, that is starting wars, that is committing genocide, that is trying to annex the West Bank. All of this is happening. There's one party at the center of it. So there's that. But the other connection is the gap between the political discourse about Israel and the reality of what's happening. So the way that it's presented is often in the West is often that Israel's actions are entirely one of self-defense and security. It's about Israel's security. And Iran happens to be the country that is often painted as an existential threat to Israel. Despite the fact that, I mean, Israel, ironically, is the nuclear armed state. Iran is not a nuclear weapon state. That should be now perfectly clear to everyone, given what happened, given the fact that Iran did not have nuclear weapons as a deterrence. And therefore, Israel was able to attack Iran, and so was the United States. The gap is the fact that, speaking again to what is Israel's ultimate point, while they argue that it's for security, Iran is a challenge to Israel's hegemony. That's what it threatens. Because if you have other states in the region that have any kind of power, really, whether it's military power, material power, or even diplomatic relations with the US that might challenge the lopsided sort of edge that Israel has within the region, then that is something that they don't want. And I'll give you a specific example kind of what I mean when I say Israeli hegemony. So the idea is that Iran is a threat to Israel because of the rhetoric that the Islamic Republic uses. And that's why Iran's nuclear program is considered a threat, despite the fact that it's a civilian nuclear program, despite the fact that Iran, under the Islamic Republic, agreed to an international treaty, the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, which was, in terms of non-proliferation, a massive breakthrough. I mean, it should have been a model to build non-proliferation work through. Instead, it was reneged by the United States, not Iran. And it was Israel that acted to undermine it over and over again. If Israel's security threat is Iran getting a nuclear weapon, the best way for Iran to not have a nuclear weapon is to have a diplomatic agreement where there's international oversight on its program. And yet Israel sabotaged that. So the other aspect of this is Iran's nuclear program goes back to before the Islamic Republic existed. In the 19, it really was initiated, the nuclear program was initiated by the monarchy, by the last Shah of Iran in the 1950s. By the 1970s, he had a plan to build, I think it was like 20 reactors and an independent nuclear program within the country. Again, civilian, for civilian applications, but an independent program where Iran would be able to enrich. Guess who was against this in the 1970s? The United States. Iran at the time was not an existential threat to Israel. They did not use or engage in the same kind of rhetoric that the Islamic Republic does. In fact, Iran was a staunch ally of the United States at the time.
Right.
And so, what is the challenge then, if it's not that? It's a challenge to Israel's edge of power within the region. Why don't we ever talk? If the threat of nuclear weapons is actually something that we're concerned about, Iran and other states in the region have supported the idea of the Middle East being a nuclear-free zone. Who doesn't support that? It would be widely supported internationally. The United States and Israel. Why? Because Israel has nuclear weapons. And in order for it to be a non-nuclear zone, Israel would have to actually, A, admit that they have nuclear weapons, and B, give up those nuclear weapons. So it's not a question of regional stability or regional security or peace. All of the language that we hear used, none of that is the real issue. The issue is that Israel must maintain its hegemony, and anything that challenges that hegemony, that is what the real enemy is in this case. And so those are the kinds of connections that we see. On top of all of that, there's the fact that Israel has, attacked multiple countries in the region in the last 20 months or so, which culminated in attacks on Iran, which they themselves describe as, I think, like the head of the snake in terms of imagery that is used to describe Iran. So it led to finally Iran being the ultimate target. And while we have a ceasefire right now, after 12 days of Israel's aggression and Iran's retaliation to that aggression, there is, you know, is there hope that that ceasefire is going to be sustained? Again, that would require outside parties to reel in Israel's actions, especially the United States would be significant in that.
Yeah, I mean, just to follow up on that, do you think? I mean, this has been what's been so confusing, but I guess that's just natural for Trump. But do you think that Trump will put some pressure finally on Netanyahu to stop the Iran stuff? It's not clear to me about how gung ho the United States is in terms of going to on a massive war in a massive war with Iran. Do you see some brakes being put on that?
Well, when you look at Trump's actions, I mentioned this earlier a little bit. Like there is now a camp within the Republican. There's just like the Democrats that are really not. I mean, these parties, we exist in a two-party system, which is not reflective of the complex political spectrum that exists in the United States. We're definitely not defined by these two parties, especially when you look at the fact that the largest, I think, voting bloc in the US is actually independents, technically. But even within the Democrats, you see this sort of split between the progressives and the establishment Democrats. And then on the Republican side, you have what I think originated as the Tea Party camp, now I think is often called the MAGA camp, which are Trump's fervent and staunch supporters, and the neoconservative camp within the Republicans. And you saw that split in the way that U.S. policy and the Trump administration's approach to Iran and Israel's attacks played out, where there were very clearly members within the administration and within the party who have very, very openly and for a long time wanted the US and Israel to attack Iran. And then you have the wait, I thought we're not going to be interventionist camp
Right.
within the Trump administration and within Trump supporters. And that comes from the fact that President Trump himself has used that very language. I mean, it was just, I think his first major
Yep.
trip as president in this term was to the region, to Saudi Arabia, and it was in Saudi Arabia that he made, very interesting comments about the failures of Western interventionism and how when
Right.
countries in the region are left to develop on their own, they can develop fine. Like this is his language that's being used. And
Mm.
yet we saw Western intervention in Iran, the language of regime change, Israel openly using it, and Trump sort of alluding to it, but then saying it bluntly, but then backtracking on it. So when you talk about the fact that it's not clear because it
Yeah.
seems like he's trying to thread this needle where he's satisfying both sides in a way. And to some extent, that's exactly what they got. I mean, the United States attacked Iran. They attacked its nuclear sites, something that Iran hawks in the US have long wanted and Israel has long wanted. But it was short of actual, boots on the ground or military intervention or anything that would create the conditions for a regime change war. And that
Right.
could be where we see the limitations of that policy. Now, you know, these situations, war and conflict, is unpredictable by its very nature. Politics can be somewhat unpredictable. The character of President Trump is extremely unpredictable. So when you
Right.
combine all of that, it's very hard to tell where we would end up. But still, what we have seen so far is an attempt at restraint. And even if you look at Israel's recent strikes this last week on Syria, again, you see stories coming
Yeah.
out, or at least reports that say, Trump wanted Israel to stop the strikes on Syria as well. So whether that's his own ideological outlook or because he's trying to satisfy everyone, there was definitely a limitation to what it seems, at least at this point, he's willing to do. And that's why he's using the
Mhm.
language of obliteration, right? The Iran nuclear program
Right.
has been obliterated. This saves him the
Yeah.
ability, basically, he can say, well, I took care of it. There's no threat.
Right.
We
Right.
don't have
Right.
to do it anymore.
And I mean, at some level, I was thinking that he may have desired this to be the end of it, and but I don't think the Netanyahu and the Israelis will let him off the hook that easily. Sorry, just Paulina, I hand it to you. I just wanted to ask. Um, at the end of the day, are you persuaded by the argument, Asal, that this is less about the nuclear issue and nuclear weapons and more about regime change in Iran?
I think that, and this goes back to the point that I made about the monarchy and the Shah earlier. I
Yeah.
think that ultimately the point for Israel is hegemony and its power and ability to expand, take more land. I mean, this is a world of conquest, essentially. We are normalizing by allowing Israel to do what it's doing in Gaza and what it's doing in the West Bank and Syria. We are normalizing uh, land through conquest, which was supposed to be, I mean, the entire point of an international system, that notions of sovereignty and security, all of that architecture was built on the idea that we have borders and we recognize them, and you cannot take land through conquest anymore. But what we're seeing is a complete regression back to the notion of empire, right? Imperialism and colonialism never really went away, but they weren't as blatant as what we're
Mm.
seeing now. And if that's ultimately the point, then who is in power in Iran is less a question of, would Israel prefer a country or a leadership in Iran that's friendly to Israel? Of course, but they had that and they still didn't want that entity, that power, that state to have power. You can
Mm.
see this thinking, and there was a Jerusalem Post editorial opinion that was published at the very beginning of Israel's attacks on Iran, and it was calling on the Trump administration
Mm.
to basically support Israel in a regime change war against Iran. And one of the things that it was calling for was to partition the country. And that's a key component. Why are you calling to partition the country? Because Iran is a very large, geographically, it's very large. It has a large population. It has a ton of resources. And this poses a challenge to a small country like Israel within the region that's trying to be the hegemon of the region. And so if you break it apart, it makes it weaker because now it's multiple countries rather than one unified country. In that sense, again, I think it speaks to what the ultimate goals are.
Mm.
In terms of regime change, it's certainly been an Israeli policy going back for decades. I mean, in 2002, when Netanyahu was speaking to Congress as a witness, saying that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, was developing weapons of mass destruction, and encouraging the US to invade Iraq, the argument was also being made as to why this was important for Iran, because eventually you also want to get to Iran. And these are arguments
Mhm.
that decades ago.
Is the son of the Shah prepared to come back to Iran and lead the country? I mean, this is the kind of perspective we're given, that no, he's just, he's ready. I mean, to sort out the country, and this is what we're told. So yeah.
I always think that the argument is bizarre I mean, there's many reasons, but I'll make this one point. The argument is bizarre because it assumes that in a country of 90 million people, no one is suited for even if regime change did happen, which by the way, the phrasing is so interesting because regime change from inside of the country is just called a revolution. That's what those are. When from the bottom up people decide to rise up against their own government and they overthrow that government and replace that system with a new system, there is a word for that. That's revolution. But it's
Right.
interesting that we always use the phrase regime change because the idea isn't about what Iranian people, the participation of Iranian people in this process. It is what outside powers want to do, and they want to get rid of one state and replace it with another state with little consideration for what Iranians in the country want. And I think the fact that a figure like him is used as a figurehead for this concept is indicative of that very fact. You don't care about what people in the country want because you're
Right.
actually taking somebody from the outside whose only form of legitimacy is a hereditary connection to a monarchy that no longer exists. But here you have a
Right.
country of 90 million, it's a highly educated country. People are politically conscious. We've seen protest movements, political movements within the country for decade after decade, organized mobilization, people who are political prisoners, activists, human rights activists that are in prison in the country right now, and yet nobody is capable of doing this except for an outside force using the language of regime change.
Right. Right. No, absolutely. Paulina?
Yeah, just thinking about all these potential and actual consequences related to regime change, this regression into imperialism that we were talking about, and also just like the attacks that Iran has faced, I think they are so much more striking and just kind of mind-boggling in a way, considering that Iran was signatory to the NPT. It was also submitting its facilities to IAEA supervision and monitoring. And so it's kind of just like, what do we think all of these consequences that despite Iran's adherence to a lot of these institutions and norms, how will these events affect Iran's security policy and the way that it will, from this point forward, build its relationships with Western nations, their allies, and these institutions?
Now, the Islamic Republic violates international law in various ways. Um, Unfortunately, many states do this. And it is not to say, when I say that, when we're talking about the nuclear program specifically, it is not to say that the Islamic Republic is always some kind of innocent actor. That's not the case. But here's the thing. In the Western narrative, when you've lost your touch with reality and you've just sort of created these caricatures of states. This is why the language that is used is so important. I mean, Iran has talked about like it's evil. What's the problem with the word evil? Evil is an inherent quality. It's not something that you can't work with evil, right? It's evil by its very nature. It's within the nature. At the same time, the flip side of that within the Western narrative is that Israel is benevolent. Israel's nature is good. And when you start to frame issues that way, the actions of states no longer matter. It's just who's doing it. So it doesn't matter what Iran does, even when Iran, to your point, is a signatory to the NPT, allows international inspections, agrees to oversight of its program, Iran is vilified because it's within this banner of evil. No matter, even when they're abiding by international law, they're still the bad guy. And on the flip side of that, Israel can commit genocide, as we are seeing right now, and it's still always the good guy. So there's this very, you know, I almost want to call it juvenile. There's this very ridiculous way of painting the picture of how these states are acting. Most of the time, they're all acting in their own self-interest. Iran has shown, despite its, I mean, when I say the actions of the Islamic Republic, the most important of it is the actions against its own people. We've clearly seen that. So again, this is not to say the Islamic Republic is on a different kind of caricature, like they're always a good actor. But in the case of the nuclear question, yeah, of course, they're leagues ahead of Israel. Israel doesn't even admit that it has nuclear weapons, which
Right.
Iran has tried to abide by that. But when you reduce states, just like if you did it with individuals, into these kind of cartoonish characters, then you're not having real conversations. Because all politicians have to say is, you know, Iran backed something or other, and all of people in the Western mind and the psyche is, well, that should be bad because Iran is bad. So anything Iran does has to be bad. And if it's Israel, then anything that they do has to be good. So what happens now, to get to your question about how does Iran engage with this system given everything that's happened? Well, you still see that Iran is attempting to, you know, it has signaled in some ways that they're still open to negotiations as long as, and this seems like a very simple, basic concept, as long as there are guarantees that the US won't attack them again during negotiations, like the US did. But essentially, the argument from Iran is, look, the IAEA is an international institution. It's the international body that is supposed to oversee nuclear facilities throughout the world to make sure that they're, you know, following international protocols and laws. Iran's facilities were under IAEA inspection, and yet they were attacked by two nuclear-armed states, and no one condemned those states. International community didn't condemn those states. The IAEA didn't condemn those states. Ironically, the Western countries and Europe condemned Iran for retaliating against attacks because no country has the right to self-defense besides apparently Israel in the region. So how do you, it's not just a question of Iran, but how does any country grapple with this idea that there's clearly always been a selective application, but the level to which that selective application has played out in the last 2 years, especially in the last 3 years, I would say, because there's two issues that have occurred simultaneously. One is the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and the other is Israel's genocide in Gaza. And there could not be a more starkly contrasted geopolitical situation than looking at these two wars play out at the exact same time and how they've been treated by the Western world. So it starts to raise the question, again, not just for Iran, but for every country to say, well, why are we even pretending to engage in a system that clearly does not care about any of these rules? And that is a risk to global security. That is a risk to, again, not to say that it was working very well, but at least something was there. At least it felt like, you know, 2 years ago, I would have thought if any country attacked every hospital in another territory, this would be a condemnable crime. There would be outrage, there would be outcry, there would be sanctions, the international community would act against it. Apparently that's not the case because we saw these same actors do that when, you know, Russia was the party that was doing it. So we didn't see the same kind of response to Israel's actions. When you lose the idea of respecting that order or respecting sovereignty, then you invite those actors to also violate your sovereignty, your civilians, your civilian infrastructure. And so even if we don't care, if I'm sitting in the United States right now, I'm an American. So even if as an American or another American, my neighbor does not care about what is happening over there, that kind of a concept, like that's over there, that has nothing to do with me. It does have to do with us because once these systems completely break down, we can fall under the same risks as well because we've now invited these other countries to completely drop every protocol. And that's what we're seeing with Iran when they've decided the parliament passed a bill to not cooperate with the IAEA. Why? Because the IAEA didn't condemn attacks on their facilities. So these international bodies have to work consistently, or if they completely fail, then it changes the calculus of most basically the entire global south and why they should engage in these systems at all.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
I was just going to say that. I mean, one question that this begs is that of what's the hypocrisy, the non-stop double standards, hypocrisy, complete desecration of international law that the Iranian people are seeing that's being done against their country. Um, Taking into consideration that obviously Iran is a big country, 90 million people. I mean, I say the same thing when I'm speaking about Pakistan, 240 million people. Um, is there a dominant view right now within the Iranian populace that um, basically on two things? One, on the nuclear issue, that perhaps there's no choice at this stage than to perhaps pursue a nuclear weapon, or just more generally that even those that, of course, I'm uncomfortable with these terms when they speak about the moderates, the reformists, the this, the that, whatever. I'm uncomfortable with those terms, but when they say, when you would now perhaps think that even many of those folks are very disappointed with the way the West has dealt with Iran, and Iran is, and again, the term that I don't like, is becoming more hardline, or more, will be in some ways even more resistant to whatever Western and Israeli plans are in the region.
Well, one thing to keep in mind is, remember I said Iran has signaled that it's still open to negotiations if those negotiations have guarantees of, not being bombed while they're negotiating. Again, extremely basic. The reason is because despite the fact that Iran is often presented as the very like zealous ideological state, their actions are quite pragmatic because again, they're acting in their own national interest. They're very cognizant of the fact that in terms of power, there's massive asymmetry of power. I mean, the United
Mm-hmm.
States compared to Iran, is not, I mean, we always hear in the US in the political discourse that Iran is a threat to the US. I mean, this is a laughable concept
Yeah.
because how so? Iran has been under sanctions for 46 years, for the last 10 years or so under high pressure sanctions that have decimated the middle class. It has no ability to do the same to the United States. When Iranian elections are held, there's probably a handful of Americans who actually follow politics in Iran and are paying attention to it. When American elections are held, people in Iran stay up late at night to watch because of that, because of the impact that US policy has on their like individual personal lives. So there's a huge asymmetry in power. Israel and the United States are nuclear armed states. Iran is not. So in terms of conventional military warfare, especially aerial, it's again
Mm.
completely asymmetric. So they understand all of these things. They don't want a massive war. We've seen that a number of times in the way that Iran has responded to attacks. And that's the key to this is that again, Israel attacked Iran, Iran responded to it. When we saw last year two attacks from Iran into Israel, those were both responses again to Israeli aggression. Attacks on their embassy, assassinations carried out in Tehran. So looking at their actions tend to be pragmatic in many ways because they're trying to protect themselves. I mean, the state, the Islamic Republic, is trying to protect their own ability to rule, and also the state itself. It's. I hate painting, and this is Israel, the United States, Iran, whatever state you're talking about. They're not monoliths. They're complicated.
Exactly.
There's many people involved, and not everybody has the same incentives, motivations, or belief systems. So, getting to the other part of your question, though, in terms of, what are the views of nuclear weapons, and does this create a more, hardliner view of what should people do within the country? I cannot tell you a predominant view because I don't know that I have like the data to back up and say this is the current predominant view. But within the populace, you can point out to some sort of trajectories at least. If you go
Yeah.
back 10 to the JCPOA. We're now exactly, it was July of 2015, if I'm not mistaken, when the JCPOA was officially agreed to, the Iran nuclear deal. There were celebrations in the streets of Iran when its foreign minister, Javad Zarif, at the time, was welcomed back into the country. He had a hero's welcome because this was a huge accomplishment that was seen from, and I'm talking about the ordinary population. That means they were very much not against the idea of Iran having nuclear weapons and for nuclear diplomacy. That has the popularity of the deal has obviously declined because it didn't work. The US reneged on it. They're under maximum pressure, sanctions. It didn't work. So the popularity of the deal has declined. And there's been a shift in the way that the nuclear question is talked about. To your point, there is more talk about, well, if we had had weapons, if we had nuclear weapons, Israel would never have attacked us. This is now a thought that exists within it. And there's a significant shift in beliefs because that's a valid point. If Iran had nuclear weapons, would they have been attacked? Probably not. They had held the idea that being a nuclear threshold state, meaning they had the ability to create nuclear weapons because they had the knowledge to do so, but they've chosen not to weaponize their program, would be enough of a deterrence. What we saw with Israel and the US attacks is it was not enough of a deterrence. So, how does this change their calculus when they're taking everything into account? Obviously, if Iran decided to move towards a weaponization program, they're inviting more attacks by Israel and the United States. So, there's a lot of complexities in the political calculations that they're making, but it did create um, an effect within the country where people rallied around the homeland.
Yeah.
Less so the government. It's not about the government, but
Right.
this disconnect between, our are the United States and Israel really here to help the Iranian people? Well, if they were, they wouldn't kill 1,000 civilians and bomb their energy infrastructure, which is civilian, and bomb apartments and just, I mean, there was footage of Tajrish, which is like a center of residential buildings and commerce in the capital city, the street exploding. I mean, a massive explosion within the street. And so when they juxtapose those images and that experience with the language that's used, it's hard to reconcile. And so I think the predominant view was one of, even though we have extreme grievances with the state itself, we can simultaneously have grievances with the fact that we're being attacked.
Right, right, absolutely. But I'm wondering, after the 12-day exchanged war between Israel and Iran, after that was because we have, again, we don't know the exact evidence. The Israelis have still not come clean about how much damage has been done. Was there a sentiment in Iran that, that we can at least respond. We can respond to Israel. We can engage Israel. We will not be completely annihilated by Israel.
That sentiment certainly exists. Again, whether it's there's you'll find the whole spectrum. You'll probably find people who think we won, we showed that we can hit Israel, and Israel, ran away scared. There's that kind of narrative. There's the opposite, right? The very, very opposite narrative, which is we completely lost, like we're in a weak position. But then I think what is again like a prevailing view
Mm-hmm.
is the initially when Israel attacked, Iran's defenses were completely unprepared for what was happening. And initially there was a lot of, I mean, there was fear throughout it, but initially there was a lot of also anger towards the state of like, what, we have no defense system. We have nothing, we're being hit, and it seems like we're completely vulnerable. When they mounted a counterattack and were able to actually use their air defenses, I think the sentiment changed a bit as well. And again, that's what I mean by the rallying around the nation effect. And we saw the Islamic Republic really capitalize on this, and they have done so in the past as well, but really capitalize on that moment to harness nationalist language and nationalist rhetoric, to tap into those emotions. So, I think there are mixed feelings about what it is. Ultimately, I think the population is just as aware as the government itself, which is they don't want a war because they see it as
Right.
destruction. I mean, they're looking at the region, they're looking at their neighbors, and they're thinking, when has this worked out well? And with that, I mean, there's just no examples where it has. So the fear is in any kind of long-term war. They really don't want, most of the population really does not want anything like that.
Yeah, I think Paulina, I mean, probably wants to. We can discuss about the multipolarity and what's going on with the other nations. But just before that, I just wanted to get your thoughts on what we all call the axis of resistance. That, of course, Israel claims that Iran is the head of the snake of. Um, it's perhaps undoubtable that they have suffered many defeats in the region over the past year and a half. Um, do you have any thoughts on kind of, of course, the central role of Iran within that, but generally of how the Israelis have, in some ways, pacified Hezbollah in Iran, in Lebanon, and what the continuing bombing, fragmentation of Syria, and so on. So, any thoughts on kind of what's the state of? I love your book, The State of Politics. What's the state of the so-called axis of resistance?
It's certainly been degraded a great deal. If you look at Hamas, if you look at the killing Israel, like targeting the leadership of Hezbollah, and that force has been degraded quite a bit as well. Iran has been hit, its nuclear facilities have been hit, like all of these things have happened. One thing I would keep in mind when we talk about the axis of resistance is it's often painted like I don't like the use of the word proxy, even though we love using that in the West, Iranian proxies. And the reason is because it creates this, I mean, that's precisely the language of like the head of the snake, or I've seen
Yeah,
Israeli officials, for instance, use these like sort of grotesque images of Iran's like leadership as an octopus and it has
yeah,
many tentacles, that kind of imagery. Um, while Iran is obviously a powerful actor that ties in some ways these groups together, they are independent. They have agency. They act on their own behalf as well. And they're very different relationships. If you compare Iran's relationship, for instance, to Hezbollah, which Iran helped
mm-hmm.
create in the wake of Israel's invasion of Lebanon in the early 80s, that is very different than Iran's connections to, say, the Houthis, or Iran's connections to Iraqi militias, Shiite Iraqi militias, versus Hamas, I mean, Hamas and Iran, for instance, were not on the same side of the civil war in Syria. So
Right,
there, this idea that they're sort of a puppet master
right,
really contradicts the reality on the ground. And so what they've tried to do from their own sort of defensive posture is to push conflict, push war outside of Iran's borders. And that's how one of the ways that they've used the axis of resistance. And where their interests align, they work
mm-hmm.
together. And their interests don't align, they don't. So there's certainly been a lot of weakening of the axis of resistance. But I think what's interesting about these questions always to me is when until the root of the problem is addressed, it doesn't matter what you do to these groups because something else will sprout out in its place.
Right,
They are not the cause. They are the symptom of the cause. Uh, like I said, Hezbollah exists because of Israel's invasion of Lebanon. Hamas exists because of Israel's occupation of Palestinian land. If we refuse to look at the root causes, then we'll just be in this endless cycle. And the most concrete and simple example I can give you is at the end of the Biden administration, at the time, Secretary of State Blinken was asked about Hamas's capabilities. And he said their estimate, US intelligence estimate, is that Hamas has basically recuperated the number of people that had been killed by Israel.
right.
These are based on their own numbers, by the way, which
Yeah,
are questionable at best. Nonetheless, the implication of the point, right, the details of its accuracy aside, the implication of the point is, guess what happens when you go out and you kill people's entire
right,
families?
right. Well,
It,
one wonders, does he know what he's saying? I mean, yeah, exactly. Right.
you're not addressing the problem because all of it is always framed as the only thing that matters, not the one thing that matters, but the
Mm-hmm.
only thing that matters is Israel's security. Israel, you cannot argue for your security when you are the cause of an entire people's insecurity? Security is mutual. When they live in occupation, you cannot be secure. So, because again, the question is not really about Israel's security, it's about Israel's ability to expand and take land and occupy and expand settlements. And as long as they want to do so, their security will always be under question because you are imposing insecurity and oppression on an entire population of people.
Absolutely. Paulina?
Yes, just as a final question, because you had mentioned how at the core of this all, um, targeting of Iran has to do a lot with regional hegemony. And so I just wanted to know what your opinion is on the role that Iran plays on the larger scale, like in the global order that we have today, which is shifting now with the emergence of new institutions like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And so, yeah, I just wanted to know if you could expand on that point.
Iran within the region is obviously an important actor, if for no other reason, because of its, like I said, its sheer size, its resources, its population. All of these things make it just its geographical position, which is why, I mean, if you look at the history of what is modern day Iran and that area of the region, I mean, many of the largest empires in the world have centered in that geographic area. So there's something to that. And so they're regionally an important power. Are they the hegemon of the region? No, I wouldn't say that because there's competing powers within the region. Obviously, Israel being another competing power, Saudi Arabia being a significant competing power. On a global scale, what is Iran's role? I think, Iran exists as a country in isolation, um, for very intentionally. It's isolated in order to limit its power. But what's more important, I think, in some sense, is sort of what it symbolizes, which is, if you don't follow the protocols of, if you don't basically surrender to whatever is the hegemonic powers within the region, which in this case would be Israel and the United States, then you will be isolated continuously. Is that a sustainable system? Well, things like Shanghai Cooperation and BRICS and other global South initiatives to counterbalance those systems is an indication that it's not. So it's not that it's individually uh, a player that's making all of these moves, but it is a significant country within the global South that can play an influential role in whether or not there is sort of a counterbalance. And that's why we've seen, while, there's this idea of a pivot to the East where Iran has focused more on its relations with countries like Russia and China and its regional neighbors, especially in recent years, re-establishing diplomatic relations with states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, trying to make inroads within its own region and focusing less on the West. At the same time, they're cognizant of the fact that that has not happened yet. Yes, we're in an emerging multipolar world, but we're not actually there yet. The United States is still unilaterally the most powerful entity in the world, not just for its military, but for its economy, not its own economy, but its power within the global economy. The fact that the global economy still runs on the dollar, and that's why you saw President Trump threaten the BRICS states, I think it was with 200% tariffs if they tried to create or they tried to create a different currency, right? Anything that might challenge the power of the dollar. So you can see that these, I mean, if you want to have empire, that's fine. You can have empire. Let's just call it that. Let's stop calling it a rules-based system. It's not what it is. But when you have empire, you invite competition for who is on top. And that's what we're seeing emerge. And Iran is just one of many actors within that because it is not part of the Western Bloc, so to speak.
Right. Well, thank you very, very much for elaborating on all these points and shedding light on what is absolutely a complex situation in West Asia. I certainly learned a lot, Junaid.
Assal, this was a tour de force interview with you. It was so grateful to spend this time with you. So thank you so much for having this
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the work that you guys are doing, and just for creating another platform where we can have these conversations. I appreciate it.
Wonderful. Look forward to having you back again as well.
Happy to.
Thanks. Okay, bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.